Great. Great. Welcome, everybody. As participants are still joining in, today we will use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. And similar to how we opened up the first session of the Great Lakes TEK speaker series, we would like to again acknowledge and recognize the Indigenous homelands and territories that you are joining in from today. So if you could please share in the chat which native land you are calling in from. There's a link in the chat. We would also just like to start with a moment to acknowledge a mass grave that was recently found, I believe, in British Columbia. Indigenous children at a residential school in Canada. So we want to acknowledge a lot of mourning that is happening at this time. And if anybody needs it, there is a resource, Indian Residential Schools Resolution Health Support Program, which is a national Canadian Indian residential school crisis line that is set up. It's a 24-hour national crisis line for emotional support, and that Andrew will put in the chat. So with that, since there was a couple minutes late, I didn't know all of the attendees are here. I thought it was just panelists. So welcome to the Great Lakes Traditional Ecological Knowledge Speaker Series. Today's session is on Braiding Ways of Knowing, TEK Theory, Methods, and Ethics. I would also like to start off with introducing myself. Buju Anin, Anishinaabe Kwe, Niganigo Kwe, Ziguan Kwe, Jinakaz, Nigek Endodem, Wikwe Dang Idunjaba. My name is Jessica Koski. I am Anishinaabe from the Keweenaw Bay Indian community, which is located in Michigan's Upper Peninsula on the south shore of Lake Superior. I am participating today from Dakota Homelands in Minnesota, where I serve as a regional biologist and program manager for the Bureau of Indian Affairs Midwest region. In this role, I also serve as the U.S. co-lead for the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement Annex 10 Science Traditional Ecological Knowledge Task Team. The Great Lakes TEK Speaker Series seeks to connect and share lessons across Indigenous communities and increase awareness of the value of Indigenous knowledge and how to appropriately bridge knowledge systems. The series is presented by Annex 10 of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement in partnership with the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities Department of American Indian Studies. And it is co-organized by myself and also Andrew Preston, who serves as the Canadian co-lead for the TEK task team, as well as TEK task team US caucus member Jessica Dolan. Jessica is the lead organizer coordinator for today's session. She'll also be serving as the moderator today. Michael Dockery had a family emergency, so he wasn't able to be with us today. So Jessica will help with leading the moderating. Jessica serves as an ethnobotanist on contract with the St. Regis Mohawk tribe in Akwesasne, and she is a member of the Conservation Through Reconciliation team based at the University of Guelph in Ontario. So at this time, I will pass it to Andrew to introduce himself. Thank you. Miigwech.
Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Andrew Preston. I'm a senior policy analyst within Environment and Climate Change Canada, and I co-lead with Jessica Koski, the Great Lakes Water Quality Annex 10 TEK task team. So I'm speaking to you from where I live, not far from the shore of what in English is called Lake Ontario, on land cared for and called home by countless generations of Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee. This is Dish with One Spoon territory. It's a bountiful place that is meant to be shared in peace so that no one goes hungry. Where I am is also on land covered by Treaty 13, an agreement between the Crown and Mississaugas of the Credit signed in 1805 that not only made it possible for settlers to come and live here, but also establishes the responsibilities that newcomers continue to have to the Mississaugas of the Credit and to the land and to the water to be good treaty partners and support all people's efforts to live a good life. Before getting started with today's program, I'd like to go over some housekeeping items. First, in terms of how this session will unfold, There's going to be 3 presentations, each approximately 15 minutes in length. Following these 3 presentations, we're going to move into the question and answer portion of the program. Approximately 20 minutes is allotted for this. Everyone has been placed on mute for this session, so to pose your questions, we would like you to use Zoom's Q&A function. You should see the bottom for that. The button for that at the bottom of the screen. We will be collecting questions as they are posed throughout the 3 presentations, and we'll return to them during the Q&A portion. So please submit your inquiries as you think of them, rather than waiting for the Q&A session to begin. If you want to share other information with the larger group, please use the chat function. And if you're posting to the larger group, take care to ensure that you address your notes to all participants rather than just to the panelists or the organizers. Finally, finally, I guess actually Dr. Jessica Dolan has already been introduced by Jessica Koski, so that's great, that's taken care of. And so with that, I'll just pass it over to Jessica to introduce today's speakers. So Jessica, take it away.
Thank you, Andrew. Hello, everybody. I'm Jessica Dolan, and I'm zooming in from Abenaki and Wabanaki homelands in Brattleboro, Vermont. The indigenous name for this town is Wantastikok, and the river that I am sitting next to is the Quineticu River, or the Connecticut River. Thank you so much for attending the second session of the Great Lakes TEK Speaker Series. In planning this series, we decided to create a session that highlights the work in Indigenous environmental studies that has been and is being done related to Great Lakes traditional ecological knowledge. We want to do this to bridge theory, methods, and ethics that Indigenous scholars have been building through academia with environmental management, policy building, and what is being done on the ground in environmental projects. We began the series with a session on TEK guidance initiatives in Canada and the US. And now in this session, we'll hear from 3 great Indigenous scholars on how they are applying their work to building theory and methodologies and articulating ethics that will inform best practices in First Nations and tribal communities, and in co-management and joint stewardship partnerships between Indigenous American and Canadian governments. So I have the great privilege of introducing these scholars today, who I'm so thrilled that we get to hear from and learn from. First, I'm going to read their brief biographies in the order that they'll speak, and then we will hear from Dr. Deborah McGregor after that. So, Professor Deborah McGregor joined York University's Osgoode Hall Law Faculty in 2015 as a cross appointee with the Faculty of Environmental Studies. Her research has focused on Indigenous knowledge systems and their various applications in diverse contexts, including water and environmental governance, environmental justice, health, and climate justice. After Professor McGregor, we're going to hear from Neil Patterson Jr., who was born into the White Bear Clan as a citizen of the Tuscarora Nation. Neil has worked with the Haudenosaunee Environmental Task Force since its inception in 1997. He is founder of the Tuscarora Environment Program, a US EPA-funded environmental organization that addresses solid waste, drinking water, food sovereignty, hydropower relicensing, outdoor youth education matters of the Tuscarora Nation. His work has been to celebrate, restore, and build relationships between Indigenous communities and their Aboriginal territory. Patterson currently serves as Assistant Director for the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment at the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Onondaga Territory. He teaches courses in traditional ecological knowledge and oversees environmental research, education, and outreach initiatives associated with Indigenous peoples. He's also the current co-chair of the National Tribal Science Council, a tribal partnership group of the US Environmental Protection Agency. Our third speaker will be Dr. Kelsey Leonard, who is a water scientist, a legal scholar, policy expert, writer, and enrolled citizen of the Shinnecock Nation. Her work focuses on Indigenous water justice and its climatic, territorial, and governance underpinnings for our shared sustainable future. Dr. Leonard represents the Shinnecock Nation on the Mid-Atlantic Committee on the Ocean, which is charged with protecting America's ocean ecosystems and coastlines. She also serves as a member of the Great Lakes Water Quality Board of the International Joint Commission. Dr. Leonard has been instrumental in safeguarding the interests of Indigenous nations for environmental planning and builds Indigenous science and knowledge into new solutions for sustainable water and ocean governance. I want to say to the three of you before you begin, thank you so much for being here, for sharing your knowledge and your work. It is such an honor to have you participate in this series, and we are so grateful that you've made time to share with us. So without further ado, Professor Deborah McGregor, please take it away.
Okay, hopefully I'm muted. Yeah, well, thank you, everyone. And I'm trying to imagine everyone's time zone. So I'm assuming it's at least afternoon for most folk. So good afternoon, Ani bonjour. So Deborah, Indigenous cause, Whitefish River, Donjuba, Makwa Dodem, Anishinaabe, and my more boring existence is Deborah McGregor at York University, Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice, and I'm still kind of distracted in reading everyone's chat about where everyone's coming from, but it's pretty amazing to see because a lot of folks, I think I've met you and I think I know you. And actually on this panel, I've met Neil before, I think it was like 20 years ago when the International Joint Commission had a meeting in Montreal. We were on a panel or something. And anyway, so it's good to see Neil and Kelsey. And thank goodness I'm first, so I can be boring as opposed to trying to follow up really amazing presentations from the others. So I'll try my best to address the focus of today. So I did prepare a PowerPoint largely because it'll keep me on track. I've got 15 minutes, but before I started, I want to just give a bit of the background of where I'm coming from with this. So for over 20 years, I realize now, probably like 25 to 30 years, I've been working on the Great Lakes water file from different perspectives. I worked for Environment Canada. I guess, I don't know if Andrew's the new me, or I used to be the Andrew or something, but and part of what I did, part of one of my focus areas or files was traditional ecological knowledge and trying to advance that within the department. And also with the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. When I first started there, there was no mention of Indigenous peoples in there. There was no mention of traditional ecological knowledge. And actually it was like a lot of advocacy from Indigenous peoples, tribes in the US to really try to advance that. And then have it recognized domestically in the Canada-Ontario agreement as well. So it took a really long time from when there wasn't anything to finally it's there. So and I share that for a couple of reasons. One is I'm hoping that we're past the point where we're trying to say why it's important, because that's what a lot of it was in the beginning. Why is this important? Why should it be there? We can't, like, relying only on Western science, as important as it is, isn't the only way to try to understand the health of the Great Lakes and what we need to do to restore, protect, and conserve the Great Lakes, and actually have Great Lakes flourish. So I'm hoping that we're kind of past that, where we're trying to convince people, one, it's a thing, it's a real thing, and secondly, that it's important. So now there's at least that recognition, and maybe respect. I'm hoping we'll get there, recognition, and maybe there would be the respect. So that took a while. And I'm hoping also that we're a bit, it's always in the radar that we're a bit past the binary of Indigenous knowledge and Western science, because that's what people were talking about 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago. But I think we're kind of hopefully past that, where we're not just always thinking about it that way, but about, okay, well, how do groups of people, how do we actually have different knowledges sort of interact and engage with each other? Like, hopefully that's kind of the space that we're at, but it's taken a long time to get there. And certainly I'm in spaces where we're back to square one, going, where I'm asked, what's traditional ecological knowledge anyway? And I'm like, oh, here we go. Okay, I have to answer this question again. and I just sort of accept that's an ongoing process. But there has been a development in the field over the years. I also worked for the Chiefs of Ontario, and in some ways continue to do so in relation to Great Lakes and traditional knowledge work. So I also come at it also from that perspective, more of the community-based perspective, where we're thinking about water quite differently, and the Great Lakes quite differently, not like H2O or just an ecosystem, but in a very different way. And how do you try to advance and advocate for a different kind of understanding of the Great Lakes and water in different ways? So some of that is reflected in the water declaration that First Nations contributed to as part of a water policy forum, reflected in there in terms of what in Ontario anyway, I can speak to in terms of relationship to the Great Lakes. So just coming at this from a number of different perspectives, and also growing up in the Great Lakes. Whitefish River literally is Manitoulin Island, big freshwater island in the middle of the Great Lakes. So constant interaction with water. Although literally right now I'm sitting in a chair in Toronto, which on a map it looks like sits right beside the Great Lake, Lake Ontario, but I actually can't see it from where I am. So those are the different perspectives that I'm coming from, and how I've seen and tried to advance how Indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge should be considered in these kind of conversations. So I'll share my perspective, recognizing that different folks have different perspectives on this. So I will share screen, and hopefully the right presentation shows up, and I got rid of all my other, so everyone doesn't have to read my emails. So hopefully, can folks see that? Because once I start this slideshow, start from the beginning, then everything disappears, and then I can no longer tell the time. So someone will have to send me a chat or signal to me when I have to stop talking. So can you see it, Jessica? Thumbs up, you're on my screen. Okay, good. So sort of a lot of the thinking right now around how Indigenous, what I'm more broader than traditional ecological knowledge, I think about it also as in terms of Indigenous knowledge systems, interacts with other knowledge systems, because it is Western knowledge systems isn't the only other kind of knowledge systems that are out there, is how that's changed over time, and where some of the current thinking is, like what does engagement actually look like? Because I'm hoping that's sort of the headspace that we've gotten to at this point. So hopefully I can talk a little bit more about that. And one of the reasons why like TEK is important, and actually I was on a panel maybe 2 weeks ago with Henry Lickers and others. So he's the keynote. Then I was on a different panel, also on the Great Lakes and traditional knowledge. And he made it very clear, as others have done, that TEK itself doesn't just refer to Indigenous peoples, traditional ecological knowledge. Other people can have this knowledge as well. But generally, when I'm speaking about it, I'm specifically speaking about Indigenous peoples, or more specifically Anishinaabe, because we're not all the same. It's very diverse. And so I tend to use the terminology of Indigenous knowledge systems, even though in my own work that's changed over time. But here I just say TEK, because that's kind of what's in the agreements. So what I wanted to outline is kind of how the field has kind of changed over time, how people thought about this. So initially, here I have ATK, because for a while that's kind of what was federally recognized in legislation. People called it Aboriginal traditional knowledge. Now it's Indigenous knowledge in federal legislation. So initially, people were kind of working in this field because particularly proponents, because they had to show that they were considering ATK or traditional knowledge or TEK in their assessments of whether a project's going to go forward or not, or whatever it could be. It could be recovery species for Canadian Wildlife Service, or other processes that that this work would take place through doing research. So you would do your literature review and maybe surveys and interviews. Like basically you could do this work without actually talking to Indigenous peoples. And I've seen that. Actually, my PhD research talked about it wasn't like that. People were doing, they would look at archaeological evidence and make assumptions about Indigenous people. So you could literally do this without Indigenous people. Very kind of a linear approach, very conventional approach. and without any engagement with Indigenous people. And if there was, it was very typical. It was very, okay, we're going to go out and we're going to interview 20 people or something like that, or survey people, which in my opinion is like one of the worst ways that you can, like, to actually get an in-depth knowledge of a particular place. Like literally, I think you have to kind of have to be there. So there were particular methods, and those generally came from the academic world. And in Canada, a lot of it also came from land use and occupancy studies, part of the land claim processes. So people had to like document in very particular kind of ways knowledge in order to be able to advance Aboriginal title or treaty claims. And that's why you see co-management here sometimes in the north and other places. It would result in co-management kind of regimes, but it was very conventional and it was very limited. And generally people were kind of disappointed in this approach because the whole world was somehow supposed to be all sustainable because some tech got extracted from some community, got jammed in some kind of process, and we we're all supposed to be thrilled about that. And why isn't the world still sustainable? And pretty well global scientific report says otherwise at this point. And Indigenous peoples weren't happy because they didn't see their decisions reflected, or they didn't see their knowledge reflected in any kind of decision making. So this still continues. I'm not going to say it's in the past, but we've kind of moved on from this kind of approach, but it was a very dominant approach for a while. And a lot of those methods often still remain. People started to realize, I think we actually need to talk to some people in the communities about this. And then it sort of advanced to maybe they should actually be part of the interpretation, analysis, and decision-making around their own knowledge. But that was not the initial thinking in this field. So there is a continuum. This is very linear in terms of how it, because it was very linear in terms of how it was approached initially. And it's I still see this. I mean, I peer review all the time as part of my job, and also review proposals. And I still see, like, I go, this is what people did in the 70s and 80s. That's not really what we do anymore in this work. So, but it's still there. Here, this is just, I like this work. You can find this open access, Nicholas Hood's piece in 2007 on description of traditional ecological knowledge, because he was moving beyond the binary. He was starting to recognize that there's different levels and scales to traditional ecological knowledge. It wasn't just some blob of knowledge that was there somehow floating around in a cloud in Indigenous communities that you could just come in and extract. I don't have time to get into all the different levels, but what he did in his analysis was kind of point to, he pointed to where, resource managers, environmental managers were comfortable, which parts of this knowledge system they were comfortable with, and that's what they would kind of bother with. Like that's what they would sort of extract from communities. Other parts they didn't want to go there, like cosmology or ethics and values, like the water is alive and has being and spirit. They can't go there. They didn't want to go there, but they could deal with, maybe management systems, some practices, and some data. So he's starting to try to outline, like there was some places that people didn't want to go in terms of this knowledge. This was a framework that I developed that I use a lot when I'm teaching this or trying to explain it. And it came from some of the first works that were actually put out by Indigenous people in the late 1980s. Assembly of First Nation and National Aboriginal Forestry Association. And it was actually presented initially, as you see, 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't know where that shows up on your screen. My left side, probably your right. And then I sort of put it in a circle because it was too hierarchical, which is again a very common way of thinking about this, linear and hierarchy, and just said, and partly it was my discomfort with what the reports started to look like. Like I would read these TEK reports and I go, I don't think this is actually everything that people said. And there's no way that you can capture a whole way of life, thousands of years in like this booklet, or this map. And realize that what was happening in the field was a very extractive thing where certain kind of knowledge that was convenient for whoever was seeking it was what they were seeking. And so you might have data and facts, but you don't have the ethics and beliefs, you don't have the cosmology. So in fact, you actually really don't have tech. Like you have something, some data, whatever, and maybe you documented some practices, but you actually don't have the knowledge itself, because literally it lies in the people and in the community. So that's what this was trying to conceptualize, was that there was parts that people are comfortable with, and elements of it that people were not, and they weren't going to go there. So this was a knowledge sharing paradigm developed by Teresa Ryan, actually, for Environment Canada many years ago. We were trying to figure this out. Okay, if we move from the extractive mode of this is our question, this is what we want from me, we don't care about the rest, we only want this, and then we're going to go away and make a decision. That's sort of like the extractive mode. What does knowledge sharing look like? What does governance look like? What would sharing of decision making look like? Because Indigenous peoples also want to utilize science. A lot of people assume because we talk about traditional knowledge, we don't like science. That's pretty well been my whole career, where people assume that. And I'm like, no, the Indigenous people are decision makers, governing and sovereign, and they want to make decisions, best decisions that they can for the community and for the natural world. So with this kind of paradigm, it's a knowledge sharing paradigm. It recognizes that they're distinct and have they have everything that a knowledge system would have. And Teresa Ryan outlined, she's a PhD Indigenous scholar out of UBC. And there's a place that we come together to negotiate and dialogue on the knowledge. Like it's actually a discussion. You actually deliberate. People actually have to come together to do this. This is normal for Indigenous people. Even treaties and engagement that we would have with each other as different nations. We weren't generally trying to extract knowledge from each other. And that would lead into then decision making. So that there would be this engagement, dialogue, negotiation. Now people are referring to this more as ethical space, which I'll talk about a little bit later, which is kind of all the rage right now. I've always argued that Indigenous people had their own traditions, and this is something that Neil can speak to, no doubt, a lot better than I could, because he knows treaties. But this is a framework that I actually use in my thesis, heavily influenced by James Ransom from Akwesasne, because I didn't want traditional knowledge to be integrated into my PhDs in forestry into other systems. And like, surely we must have had ways of like thinking about this that didn't involve extraction and exploitation. And he said, yeah, sure. Like we have, we had our own models. So I started to look into what are our own models as Indigenous people that were there for thousands of years and worked for how we shared knowledge with each other. And that the basic premise of that also was that Indigenous peoples were complete societies that had their own knowledge systems, legal systems, governance system, and we interacted with each other, you know, in these kind of ways. Like encountering newcomers isn't the only time we ever interacted with other societies. So we have our own sort of knowledge sharing traditions and ethics and protocols that would be followed that existed. So I paid a lot of attention to those. These are just some community considerations that I'll go through more quickly because I think I'm running out of time. So these are kind of questions. Because the extractive mode, unfortunately, is still kind of the dominant paradigm, because it's very hard to shift over to a knowledge sharing what I call a knowledge sharing paradigm, because it means letting go of power and control and actually supporting Indigenous peoples, because they need support to be able to, you know, engage in the way that they would like. They have to think about how will this work for the community? How will it be used externally and by who? Transparency, what happened to what I shared? What capacity exists in communities to be able to govern knowledge themselves? It's a lot are not, there isn't that capacity in many communities. How do you govern it? Like what kind of deliberation and discussion is going to happen even at the community level to decide what's going to stay in the community and what's going to be shared externally? Because that's a decision. And what are you protecting, a way of life or just data and information? A lot of research ethics protocols are geared towards protecting data. There's a lot of information around that, but not actually anything more broader than that. And in my work, I just say, well, because knowledge is part of the people and embedded within there and how people live, there's no way you can protect it unless you're going to protect people, which means also protecting their rights and way of life. There's tensions in the field. People want traditional knowledge for different purposes. And a lot of the times Indigenous peoples are willing to share it, but there's risks like intellectual property. So a lot of the times communities are in this risk management approach. They're like, what are the risks? Like what can we share or not share? Because there's going to be a risk once it's out there and out of our control. Because again, we had our own ways of controlling knowledge. So again, what are we actually protecting for future generations? I'll just briefly just talk about this because this is central to how I think about this topic, which is Indigenous knowledge exists within a society that has laws and governance. So Indigenous knowledge systems are going to interact with Indigenous laws, our own governance systems, how we educate, and how we continue to produce knowledge. The field is more focused on traditional ecological knowledge as a noun, this data and information that you can extract from communities, but really it's part of a system. So I work at York University. I'm part of a post-secondary system in Ontario. I have to produce knowledge in particular ways. I'm considered an expert because I have a PhD. When I know an Indigenous community, I'm not in this area. I'm not a language speaker. I'm pretty useless on the land at this point. So we're in different systems. So it's a whole system. So extracting knowledge from one system and sticking it into another and hoping for the best, just that really hasn't served really anybody. Although in my opinion, it does make decisions better, having reviewed a lot of assessments in my job when I was in Environment Canada to look at how traditional knowledge, it did make it better, but it didn't like provide the answer, right, that people are looking for. So it's important to understand as part of a system. That's why I say, what are you protecting, data or a way of life or community? So this idea of ethical space is now coming into more common usage, and ethical space just basically recognizes that you are different societies and you do have different worldviews and ontologies and ways of understanding the world. And how are we going to come together using a set of principles, which in my view are going to differ because, you know, whichever nation you're interacting with is going to have their own kind of principles for how they interacted with other societies and nations, and try to have that dialogue and deliberation to figure out how they're going to work out that kind of relationship. I find in a lot of the work that I'm doing right now, I'm working on a project where we're doing a massive scan of the literature. How have people used traditional ecological knowledge? And a lot of the times, again, it's very extractive in trying to stick into these other places. And it keeps talking about knowledge as if somehow people aren't involved. People are always involved. So you're always trying to improve you're always trying to talk about what is that relationship between the peoples like, and how are we going to get there in terms of having, you know, a healthy, appropriate kind of conversation. So different models that are coming forward now is braiding knowledge systems, where you're not extracting from one knowledge to the other, weaving knowledge systems, so different terminology, linking knowledge systems, which comes from a treaty kind of relationship. So there's different, so now we're starting to get different sort of models and more development, trying to move away from that extractive sort of component and recognition that Indigenous peoples had knowledge, that were part of systems and part of complete societies. And you have to deal with Indigenous people. You just can't go out doing this kind of work without them. I'm gonna stop there. I took too long. Hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully my hands waving around made up for my lack of pretty slides. And you'll be very excited to hear from Neil and Kelsey, as I always am. So Chimigwech for listening. Oh, I'm trying to like unshare. How do I unshare? Next share. Oh, stop share. Yay. I think I figured it out. Now I'm going to stop.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Deborah McGregor, for grounding us with that. It's so important. You set us up so well to think through these things together. I think what we should do is we should just keep moving right forward to Neil Patterson Jr., and then we can engage in a wonderful discussion after all of the panelists have shared. So Neil, are you ready?
Yes.
Great.
Chwant oskenahe. Gata dequidita disna walknana skaruda equahela gayadakra. Gisa seta direchaks disna wagana harata hatwet raguana royana gayaguanata. Greetings to everyone. Thanks for joining this conversation today. Greetings also to the title holders who may be on the call from our Indigenous communities. I do have some slides to share, and would like to talk a little bit about our work around this that has been largely inspired by Deborah's work over the years, and a great gratitude for us watching on the state side all of the progress and the in the recognition of these knowledge systems that are happening north of this imaginary line across the Great Lakes. So Yawa for all of that, all those years of advocacy. I do want to begin by acknowledging these folks. When I was 3 years old, my uncle Stuart, who was part, you see in the picture here in the middle with the Gusteau in the second row, traveled to Geneva, Switzerland for the first time in many decades. And they brought a message from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and from many indigenous communities across Turtle Island to the United Nations, and began discussing the rights of indigenous peoples there. These men were sent to do this as a delegation, primarily of title holders who are installed by the women you see here in the front row, our Gaya Guanata, our clan mothers. And I want to begin by acknowledging that what I'd like to share today primarily comes from these folks. It comes from growing up on the Tuscarora Reservation near Onondaga territory, out near the Niagara River. And watching the process of how knowledge transmission occurs between generations, and also between men and women in their separate roles in our communities. One of which is to condole each other, to greet each other at the edge of the woods, as we say, to clear our minds and pick our minds up off the ground. Some of you are familiar with the term requickening, and I often think about the requickening of naturalized knowledge systems, as Henry Lickers likes to call this topic. This process of meeting folks at the edge to bring them into our common human space is one of recognition that folks may have had some hardships along the way, as we say, came through the brambles. And many of you on the call today are deep in the brambles of your own work, of writing those emails, of responding to phone calls, of doing policy analysis. And it's important as part of a protocol, really, that today is being shared often as we call land acknowledgements. Well, this is our Haudenosaunee way of greeting each other at this shared space. The three bare words that come with the condolence procedures that are used to put leaders in place. And so when these men, many of them you see here in the picture, traveled to Switzerland and to Sweden and to New York City over the last few decades, they talked about knowledge with other indigenous people from across Mother Earth. They talked about the role of indigenous frameworks, something that I've been working on quite a bit with the Tribal Science Council. As an agency, the US EPA, of course, is interested in, much like Deb described in Canada, how we think about traditional knowledge and environmental assessments, environmental impact statements, and finding that there are lots of frameworks that indigenous communities have already put into place, right? And so that's maybe the first place to start, is to ensure that when you are working with a community, that there may already be a research policy in place for accessing, for working with, for being part of this traditional knowledge. And these frameworks are really about centering the self-determination of indigenous communities and protecting controlling and maintaining that knowledge itself. Each community is different, of course, and so you have to think about the ways in which their framework applies to them and the lands that they are part of. These lands, of course, and the knowledge really were reflected well, I think, in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So here's another document I would encourage folks to study. It took decades of our leaders, our Royan, and people bundled with this task of thinking about how we maintain, control, protect, and develop these knowledge systems. And of course, there was a lot of talk about things like heirloom seeds, the knowledge that those seeds carry in our communities, the plant medicines that we are gathering as we speak in our communities, and all of these expressions of culture. So another important document, and many times throughout the document, referring to process, in particular, the notion of free, prior, and informed consent that often goes with those tribal research frameworks. So I wanted to get that out of the way, sort of the you might say the more bureaucratic side of thinking about written words and policies and procedure that Indigenous communities already have in place, and to acknowledge that. For me, this is where I learned most of what I'm going to share today. And it was just a photo I took after we made a whole bunch of cornbread at Tuscarora. We didn't do it the old way. You can see a little propane flame in the middle here of the picture. And so in our communities, we continue to maintain these traditions, and it's often these informal discussions, sitting around a fire, gathering and braiding corn together, trips to communities together. I dare say Haudenosaunee people are probably at least in upstate New York, the most well-traveled group of folks that I know of, willing to hop in a car to protect, to maintain, to control that knowledge at a moment's notice, and drive to Albany, drive to Ottawa, drive to Washington, DC to assert this sovereignty, if you will. And so for me, growing up on the reservation, it was really about being prepared. And I think that was the most essential lesson for me to think about traditional knowledge, was that you have to ready yourself. You have to think about those spaces, that edge of the woods between the brambles and all the thorns and that we carry ourselves through, into this space of greeting and of condolence, of acknowledging that we've been through a hard time with these maintaining these knowledge systems. And so I think, so many of these folks will tell me, that they are not traditional knowledge holders. They know nothing about traditional ecological knowledge. In fact, the term is often joked about in my own community as a term of art or as a lofty academic idea. Yet, in sitting with these folks, we see that knowledge expressed in so many ways. For me, and my relationship with the land began with Yutnaruhas, with the game, the creator's game of lacrosse. I grew up playing lacrosse in Canada, in Southern Ontario, and eventually learned how to make lacrosse sticks. And this is a set of photos taken recently from Unyatagahaga territory out here where I'm calling in from, Onondaga territory, of some traditional stick makers. And to follow along with these men in the woods is both an act of resurgence in reclaiming our responsibilities to the land, but also a real journey in these cultural expressions, a journey into the knowledge that these men have for the land, for the plants, the flora and fauna that go into these lacrosse sticks that are for our Creator's game. And so these lifeways, right? These lifeways themselves, as some writers have talked about it, are a deep and rich source of knowledge. And it takes some time to build trust with these folks, to be able to sit with them in the woods and listen to why they choose a tree on the south side at a certain slope for making these sticks. We do these in places across our territories, both recognized and unrecognized in both sides of the Great Lakes. And this is a great map as part of a Mohawk Atlas project coming out of Akwesasne, looking at place names. Onyat Dariyu, right? We even have that in Tuscarora, Onyat Dariyu, the beautiful lake we see here pictured in the center. And so some of our work today, both in terms of working with Native youth and also really supporting the maintenance of this knowledge of place, is built in particular on access, right? If we don't have access, so much of this knowledge is in danger of not being able to be expressed on the land. And so the first thing we look to is actually to the west, in the lakes of Michigan and Superior. We see well-developed programs by the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission in asserting this access and providing access and protecting access for our traditional lifeways and for our traditional knowledge systems. Because what follows is probably one of the most important and also misunderstood pieces of this access, and that's our tenure. That is our caretaking of these places, both in terms of providing food and medicine for our communities, but also those management systems that Deb was referring to. That's really where, that's really what is building into and is part of something we call our original instructions, right? The cycles of these places and our role to fit within these cycles is critical. We've protected access, and some of you may not often think of these as treaties responding or pertaining to Lake Ontario or the St. Lawrence system, but they do. These are treaties that I carry in my wallet when I'm out accessing the land, when I'm out taking care of the land and taking care of our families, like so many of you on this call. These 9 treaties capture our relationship, not only with settlers, but also with places. And I just so love the term here in our 1794 treaty that is so often tested in the courts on the state side, that our ancestors had we have a quick glimpse into the way our ancestors thought about land when they penned the term free use and enjoyment into the Treaty of Canandaigua as one of the most important aspects of our continued relationship of both access but also caretaking, right? that free use and enjoyment I think about quite often. Obviously a gloss over many of the Haudenosaunee words that we have in our vocabulary into the English language, but yet a real special insight when I think about this and when I think about sharing in these places and the gifts of the land with my own family. Free use and enjoyment. These treaties also ensure cross-border access, right? These responsibilities to land do not end at the border. And every third Saturday in July, my family and I would join a group of Haudenosaunee people, and we would walk across the Whirlpool Bridge, spanning the Niagara River, free of charge and free of inspection. And this is a right which Haudenosaunee people still continue today and really are part of that collective knowledge, right? The knowledge that folks have preserved these lifeways of travel, of trade, of sharing in knowledge, going back to 1613, going back to that original grandmother treaty, the Two-Row Wampum. And so you see these expressions of knowledge in these forms. And often, like Deb has mentioned, sometimes those working specifically on ecological restoration, or perhaps they're involved in contaminant remediation, have a hard time understanding why this is part of that knowledge system, as Deb points out. And the stark reality is that, all people are treaty people. And this is a photograph from that 1794 treaty, which is celebrated every year in Canandaigua, New York, where the original treaty was negotiated and signed, of our leadership from the Six Nations who continue to uphold these treaties. And it's just important, I think, for those of you joining us today to think about the moral and ethical codes that are part of knowledge systems that are expressed themselves often in treaties and in agreements between Indigenous communities and settlers. In particular, for those of you calling in from treaty lands, which are often referred to north of this imaginary border, because those folks are treaty people too, right? The International Joint Commission Science Commissioners, in their meeting with the commissioners of the IJC, well, in fact, we all know that the IJC was formed as a result of a treaty. And so these folks are also treaty people, right? If you live in our territories and are enjoying the gifts of the land, then you are a treaty person. And we need to remind ourselves of that. I'll finally finish with building on some of these models and looking at equity and justice that so many folks have turned to our communities with interest now over the last year, and the recognition of Indigenous title to land as well. That these are many times the three processes that you folks are often engaged in. Deb mentioned recognition, right off the bat. We've been fighting for recognition for a long time, and folks are finally now at the point where I think we're ready for some healing together on the land. But that is facilitated by trust, right? We call this polishing the chain in Haudenosaunee country, to wipe the tarnish off of the links that bind us, the original chain that bound the settler ships to the shore, as the metaphor is talked about today. And through that process of building free, prior, and informed consent, of coming to communities ahead of time, before even thinking about accessing knowledge and building trust for conserving and protecting land itself. Those of you fortunate enough to reach at some point of reconciliation and think about the healing process, and involved in cultural respect agreements and cultural easements, these mechanisms that are often used and take different forms in the Western Great Lakes Basin, right? The treaty tribes there that have the right to access and to take care of their homelands are often expressed through these kinds of easements and agreements. Ultimately, it is for the benefit of our communities to think about the recovery and rematriation of land as part of that healing, right? And so, you know, our notion of land itself, of the notion of what is land, is so different from an Indigenous perspective. And I think those of you on the journey towards healing probably can attest to that. That we don't think of land as property or something that can be bought and sold or traded. It is land which supports us, our lifeways, and our knowledge systems themselves. So I wanted to share that a little bit of the thinking that is that we're doing here at the center and working with all of our partners in Haudenosaunee country. Nyawa, and I'll stop sharing now.
Yawankoa, Neil, that was just so beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us and reminding us about our responsibilities for caretaking the land and for working with one another and how to think about working with one another and doing that. We're gonna go right into Dr. Kelsey Leonard's presentation, because I'm seeing we are just right on perfect timing here. And so without further ado, Dr. Kelsey Leonard, and then we will have a nice discussion and Q&A session. Thank you.
Brittany, Jessica, thank you. Let me get my slides going. Okay, I think everybody should be seeing those now. Got some thumbs up, so that's good. Wonderful. Akwe Wanikasak, hello. Good day, everyone. It's great to be with you. So as it shows here on my slides, I want to talk to you a little bit today about water walking. For some of you, you may be very familiar with what that phrase means, and for others, it may be new to you today. So before we get started, I'm Dr. Kelsey Leonard. I am an assistant professor in the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo, and I am also an enrolled citizen of the Shinnecock Nation. You can see here on the map, so I'm originally from the other side of the imagined border, and so grateful to be speaking after Dr. McGregor and Dr. Patterson. Their work is obviously just so amazing, as you have heard earlier, and so it's nice to be able to kind of close out our conversation today with a bit of how I have come to know the Great Lakes and come to know the waters of this part of Turtle Island, being from a coastal First Nation, as I mentioned, on the other side of the imagined border, located on the east end of Long Island, New York. So as you can see here, this is our traditional territory and where our reserve or reservation is. Being traditional Algonquin coastal peoples, what you may know of us, and which is, you know, it's all the universe coming together, which is really great. We are harvesters of wampum or quahog shells, which are then carved into wampum, which make the treaty belts that Dr. Patterson just spoke about. So when we think about the interconnections of water governance in this part of Turtle Island, it really means that we're all connected, and in large part, how we understand our caretaking and access to water and protection of water in the Great Lakes is also connected to the ocean and to the estuarine environments that wampum comes from. And if we wanted to take, you know, that TEK knowledge of wampum and constituting that in belts and expand it to the global climate crisis that we now face, what happens in the Great Lakes, what happens to our freshwater systems directly impacts our ocean system, directly impacts the experiences of ocean acidification. And so there's a really, really deep embedded aspects of how TEK and other types of science traditions and scientific traditions can be coming together in conversation to address some of our global challenges. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to that today, but I think it's really great the way in which this series has sort of set up the opportunity for us to do deeper dives into these conversations. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today, as I mentioned, about water walking. I won't be able to go into everything in depth, but I will point you to a TED talk that I gave about a year and a half or so ago on why lakes and rivers should have the same rights as humans. Not really my title, but kind of an idea that gets to a larger global movement of Earth law and recognizing inherent within our indigenous legal system that we recognize that other entities have a right to exist, thrive, and be healthy, and to be free from human encumbrances like pollution and domination and all that other stuff that sometimes we get obsessed with as human beings. So a big part of the inspiration for that talk came from my conversations with water walkers and came from my conversations with traditional knowledge holders throughout Turtle Island, but particularly in the Great Lakes and northeastern portions of what we now know as Canada and the United States. And what they said to me in thinking about all these, these highfalutin places like the IJC and the Great Lakes Water Quality Board and, the EPA and all these different councils, as were mentioned earlier, is you don't ask the right questions when you talk about water. You don't recognize that water is not a what, but is actually a who. And that for me was very pivotal in trying to be able to translate that to my non-Indigenous colleagues to say, we are having a disconnect in our ability to translate and communicate with one another. If we are only treating water as a what, a commodity, an object, a resource to be consumed, then we lose the opportunity to make solutions and to design solutions for some of our pressing water crises that actually ask not what do we need from the water to be able to consume it in terms of quality and quantity, et cetera, but what does the water need to be healthy and to thrive and to exist? And in doing so, we support all of the other natural entities and beings that live in that water. And that has a long-standing, traditional knowledge history in our communities. The artwork that you're seeing here is by Christy Bellacore, which really connects to our understanding for many of our communities, not all, but generally we have a consensus that water is our first medicine, that we have a deep connection to water as human beings because we're nurtured in water for 9 months as we are birthed onto this planet. But somewhere along the way, we lose that connection to water as being this medicine, this nurturing relative that we have a responsibility to, and instead have decided that it is solely there for our benefit and consumption and depletion and degradation in many ways. So despite that, there are really great people out there in the world who are fighting to protect the water. Our water protectors, those who have not lost that connection to water, but have actually been able to steward it since birth. And they're trying to teach all of us. And when we think about the Great Lakes, we have so many nations and peoples that make up the Great Lakes. There are over 200 First Nations and Indigenous Nations, Métis communities throughout the Great Lakes. And that's the drainage basin. That's not talking about US or Canada or trying to, put on some type of national jurisdiction into our conversation. It's recognizing us as original peoples, as the First Nations of Turtle Island. And we've been here. And so if you think about all of these different nations that are on this map, they each have their own unique Indigenous knowledge system and relationship that they've stewarded and built over thousands of years with the lakes. And that is an untapped, it's an untapped knowledge that we are not recognizing as a global community. As Indigenous peoples, we're like, yeah, we told you so. We knew that this was happening. Why haven't you been listening for the past, however many decades, centuries? But I think it often stems, and Dr. Patterson said this as well, it stems from an erasure of us from maps, from being visible in the policy-making, decision-making space that Dr. McGregor also spoke to. If you don't imagine that we still exist in these spaces, then you don't invite us to the table to share that knowledge and to have these sort of mobile conversations of interaction and sharing. And so I love that Dr. Patterson shared the decolonizing maps image of Haudenosaunee Ongwehongwe words for Lake Ontario. This map or mapping image comes from the Water Walker book written by Joanne Robertson, which has the Anishinaabe words for the Great Lakes, and also a connection to their basin. And so there's a real deep recognition that our traditional ecological knowledge as connected to the lakes is also embedded within our languages. And so when we think about how do we protect traditional ecological knowledge, how do we make sure that it's being advanced as a part of the larger scientific traditions contributing to decision making, it also means language protection. It means ensuring that those types of resources are put forward for our nations to be able to protect our languages. And so that leads us into how I'll close out the conversation for today, which is talking about the water walkers, in recognition that traditional ecological knowledge is not stagnant data for consumption and to be lifted into a government report and just sit on a shelf somewhere. It is a part of our living experience as Indigenous people. And so in doing some of this research, I worked with water walkers, particularly the Mother Earth water walkers, and with at the time Josephine Mandamin-Ba, who has since passed away, and Joanne Robertson, to try and document all of the wonderful work that our water walkers have been doing to and how they've been living our TEK knowledge of this part of the world for the past few decades, and how that's connected to ancestral knowledge over thousands of years. And so the original water walkers, Josephine Mandamin-Ba said that there was a prophecy that was shared that there would come a time where an ounce of water would cost as much as an ounce of gold. And if you think about our world today, that actually has already come true. If we think about the way in which water is being traded on the stock market, water futurities, and the way in which that is being experienced around our world, we already see this. And the unfortunate part is that it may get even worse. So Josephine Ba would say to us, what are you going to do about it? And that sort of started a reclamation process of water walkers across Turtle Island and now internationally that have said, a way for us to live out our teachings is to actually go to the water, to pray for the water, and to walk for the water. And so they walked all of the Great Lakes. Josephine Ba Milkness walked all of the Great Lakes multiple times, over 36,000 kilometers, and way too many sneakers to mention. But she's not alone. In that sort of reclamation of water walking in the early 2000s, it led to a larger movement of water walking, excuse me, which included the Mother Earth water walks, the Nebe walks, which are led by Sharon Day, predominantly along rivers on the US side, but have been elsewhere as well. And so since those early 2000s, we've seen over 120 walks that have occurred. And they often say in the water walking, excuse me, I'm just gonna have a quick drink of water. That was a water telling you to be like water, which is what they often say in water walking, is that you have to go with the flow. And so in doing so, I asked water walkers, why do you do this work? Because so many folks will see them out on the road near the water and they think, oh, it's those, rambunctious natives again, they're gonna do a blockade or something. And that's not what was going on. They're not protesters. They were really adamant that we shouldn't be labeled as that. It's folks not really understanding our practices. And they said, we're doing this because it's a form of prayer, it's a form of ceremony, it's a way of also passing on traditional teaching. So when I say that TEK is not stagnant, it's important to recognize that it's not something that can necessarily be passed down through written form. It has to actually be lived and practiced. And so that sharing and learning by doing is important that knowledge exchange. And so in talking with about interviews with about 40 water walkers from around the world, surveys with over 100 different water walkers, I asked them also, what was your motivation for water walking? You know, because again, there was sort of this misunderstanding and mischaracterization of them as protesters. And they said, you know, I'm doing this because it's for justice. It's for also to embody spiritual healing for the water, to protect, conserve, steward water, to restore that connection. Maybe they had that connection to water from birth severed, and they wanted to do this as a way of restoring that connection or nurturing it. Public awareness to the general, you know, to sort of the general population about the threats to water, a restoration of balance, a responsibility based on cultural teachings. They also resoundingly said that if we want to address some of the major crises facing our waters around the world, we need to embed that knowledge in education, and we need to start with the young ones. Unfortunately, they kind of said adults are maybe a lost cause, but little people, young people, they are so excited to care for water, to build that connection to water. And so lastly, the hope was that in doing all this work, that there might be a National Water Walker Day where we can build momentum nationally, internationally, to restore our connection to water, as Josephine Baugh led and taught many of us to do. And so for those that are signing on today and may want to learn more about this work, that was a very short snapshot of some of the research that I do and the work that I support across communities. I would encourage you to go and see the film called The Water Walker. It's a short film that was put out last year that features the work of water walker protector Autumn Peltier. She's a young environmental climate activist, global warrior, just superstar. And she has so much to say in that video about her journey of what it means to protect the water, and particularly the Great Lakes. Some of the images I showed with you today are from The Water Walker, which is a book by Joanne Robertson, and also one of the research partners in the research that I shared with you today. And then lastly, another book called We Are Water Protectors, which also captures some of the amazing traditional ecological knowledge and work that was done after and at Standing Rock. And that's by Carol Lindstrom, and just won a Caldecott Award, which for their sort of the Pulitzer of illustrations by Indigenous artist Michaela Good. So hopefully today, after all the wonderful presentations, you recognize that we can't do this alone. It requires us to all do our part. And if you follow the words of Autumn Peltier as she addressed the United Nations General Assembly a few years ago, she told us all to warrior up. And if a 13-year-old can do that, now 16-year-old, I think that we all have some type of work that we can be doing to address these crises. So thank you so much, Taputni, and I will turn it back over to the team for Q&A.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Dr. Kelsey Leonard. I'm so happy about how all of these conversations are coming together. It's just amazing. We couldn't have planned it better. I had some questions prepared, but now that I've listened to the presentations and we only have about 15 minutes, a little bit less, I'm going to start with reading off some questions from the participants. We had 300 participants for this webinar, which is really incredible and wonderful. So the first question I'm going to ask is, what are best practices to ensure that TEK sharing and engagement is with actual experts, knowledge holders, and people of the community in addition to Indigenous governments? Does that make sense? So I guess to ensure that many different kinds of people from the community are sharing TEK in addition to Indigenous governments. And that question is for all panelists.
I guess I can start just to get things going. I mean, some of what work that we did at Chiefs of Ontario to do that, and sometimes it's hard when people always have to follow the political protocols, which also exists within the matrix, the Indigenous worlds, I call it, again, is understanding also the knowledge sharing approach also happens within communities. And this was direction that we were given by elders, because we would have these gatherings, because Indigenous peoples and communities also want to share knowledge with each other, because there's gaps through colonization processes, residential schools, all the reasons that everybody here knows about. So people actually wanted to kind of share with each other as well. So creating those so we had these different gatherings where people could do that because they want to debate and deliberate and have discussions with each other as well. And that's beyond the observing the political protocols, which also need to be observed as well. And one of the things that they said, so that was good that we were doing that, because it's way there's so much more that comes from that, rather than going in with the individual interviews or discussion or really formulated kind of agenda that really kind of stifles sometimes those kind of conversations, especially when you're an external person coming in. And the elders just said, where's the youth? Because really who they want to share a lot of this with are youth in their own communities. So I think kind of taking that approach, which is, okay, it isn't just about if you're a government agency or even academics or whoever is coming in and even wanting this knowledge within a community, is recognizing you're trying to support learning across all generations and creating those sort of multi-generational, intergenerational sort of discussions, which means the room setup is different, the invitation is different, and we would do we facilitated this one traditional knowledge gathering in Six Nations. You put extra chairs out, people drive by and go, hey, what's going on over there, and then they just come in. You make sure there's enough food. So there's all these things to kind of enable a broader sort of understanding of traditional knowledge within the community and how it's expressed there. And I think, interestingly enough, on this panel we were on a couple of weeks ago, we were asked about wise practices versus best practices, because best practices people tend to think as being a checklist. Okay, we did this, it didn't work out. Because it's actually wisdom is like how you apply knowledge. So sometimes if something's not working, then you do something different. Like you don't keep trying to do the same thing because someone said it was a best practice. Communities are different and they're in different places at different times, and you have to be able to respond to that. And that means sometimes going with your intuition and your heart as opposed to the agenda. And we must stick to the agenda and have this particular kind of outcome. Yeah, that's all I'll say about that. Hopefully that was somewhat helpful.
We have another question. Would Dr. Leonard or Neil Patterson Jr. like to speak to that question, or shall I ask another one?
I'll just add quickly that at least in the communities that we travel in, it's sort of an oxymoron to say a TEK expert, right? That there is no one expert in this knowledge, and that often you're talking about TEK communities. And so, it's sort of like an onion. There are just so many different layers. One person might know the word for the plant. The other person might know more how to use it.
Yeah, I think what both of you already shared is spot on. I think, just building off of that, the differentiation is there's this sense within sort of Western scientific research practice of the individual and the prioritization or sort of the eliteness of the individual interview. And that also gets to what you were saying too, about there being this fascination or obsession with the expert. But on the other side, in our communities, when we think about, traditional knowledge and Indigenous data, it's collectively held. It's not an individual holds this knowledge. So when you think about what are the best research practices or the wise research practices, Dr. McGregor was saying, it's more than focusing on individual interviews. It's creating these opportunities for community sharing, for gathering, for being able to be in conversation with one another about what that collective data and knowledge is.
Okay, we have one that the organizers thought of that we want to ask, and then we have another one coming in here. We're interested in your current thoughts. And we thought of this for you, Dr. Leonard, and then also to see if Dr. McGregor and Dr. Patterson would want to weigh in on it. So what are your current thoughts on the rights of nature and our treaties with other beings and species? For example, establishing processes to establish that rivers have rights, or manuman, also known as wild rice, has rights. Yeah.
Can you ask the first part of the question? They just wanted more background on it?
Yeah, what are your current thoughts on that? As to bridge it with academia, a lot of people are interested in like anthropology of the other than human, or the larger, ethnography of the larger than human or other species thing. But we're thinking about engagement with all the species and beings, like rivers and stones and mountains and places, as how can we move forward to best acknowledge the rights of nature in our treaties with other beings and species?
Yeah, so great question. I think what it is, it's a recognition that we are already doing that within our indigenous legal systems. What we have the difficulty of doing now is translating that into Western law, and into Western law where there is a domination of property and sort of the bundle of property rights being the construction by which we understand anything having rights in the world, which is kind of the complete antithesis to saying you don't have necessarily property rights that control your legal system, but that you have responsibilities. And Dr. McGregor's work speaks to this quite frequently, as well with Dr. John Burroughs. And so when we think about where is this movement going, I work with a lot of global scholars, and we're starting to even see a transition to calling it Earth law. And it's really a recognition of those original responsibilities and treaties that we have with Mother Earth and with the planet, and that those other beings already have in terms of how they exist and relate to us as humans. So where do I see this moving forward? Hopefully more instances where there is a recognition of these inherent rights and responsibilities of other beings outside of humans across our planet being also recognized within sort of a Western law framework as best as that can be managed. But I often think of rights of nature, or the recognition of the rights of a river, or the rights of Menomen, as being that first step in transitioning our moral compass to a place of higher understanding. I think we're at a critical point in our history as human beings on this planet this period will mark a shift in how we treat or do not treat the natural world in a good way. And we're at a pivotal point to make a choice. And I think rights of nature, Earth law allows for us to make those choices, or to not make those choices as to what are our inherent responsibilities as human beings to rivers, to Menomen, to other beings, and ensuring that the planet can continue to exist, or at least I had a grandmother say, it's not that the planet won't continue to exist, is that we as humans will still have the gift to be able to exist on this planet. The planet will be fine. We just may be too dumb to realize it, of how we depend on the natural world for so much of their gifts. So I think that's what I would say in relation to that. There's been some really great movement in the Canadian context with the recognition of the Magpie River by the Innu Nation in collaboration with non-Indigenous municipalities. So I will say that if we want to see this work move forward, if we want to see there to be more recognition of Earth law globally, it does require partnerships. And I think someone asked that earlier, how can I be a good ally for TEK? There's a lot of avenues, and maybe Earth law is one avenue for you to also be an advocate for.
Thank you so much. It's exciting, but it's a big responsibility right now, hey? Doctors McGregor and Patterson, would you like to weigh in on this question, or shall I field another question to you?
I'll add to the amazing answer that Kelsey talked about is, I think the rights of nature personhood, like not everyone kind of buys into it, but it's a growing kind of movement that already existed within Indigenous communities and is now becoming a thing, is that I think it'll help with the transformation that we're calling for. So all these big reports that come out and say the planet's in a disaster and we completely need to transform, I think this helps with that. It requires people to go, what does that mean? And start that kind of process around really thinking about the broader world differently, the natural world differently, these other beings and entities differently. So I think it's sort of like that little push for that transformation that they talk about that actually no one can actually describe, like at all these different levels and scales. So to me, that's probably one of the big things with it, is just gets people just that little bit to start going, oh, I didn't know that was a thing, and start to try to learn about it, so that hopefully can lead to more, you know, transformative thinking and creativity and imagination in terms of yeah, the kind of world we want to live in and what that looks like and how we're going to contribute to that.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and then we're going to close it out. This is a classic question, but it's an opportunity, an opportunity to speak to it. This is from the viewers. What are some of the ways people of non-Indigenous backgrounds can support Indigenous, anonymous manatee, your cursor's in the way. Support communities and be better allies, especially related to revitalizing and sharing space for TEK. I'll read it again. What are some of the ways people of non-Indigenous backgrounds can support Indigenous communities and be better allies, especially related to revitalizing and ensuring space for TEK? This is to any panelist. Neil Patterson, do you want to speak to this?
Sure. Yeah, obviously there are so many both political, social, and economic paths towards becoming people are often calling an accomplice, you know, as opposed to an ally. And so we know of those opportunities of both philanthropy, but also advocacy in law and in policy. You know, I think as Deb was pointing out, this transformative thinking that has to happen, obviously needs to happen on an individual level too. And so I often think about a lot of those of you on the call, your work in things like you know, consent decrees for Superfund cleanups. I'm not sure what it's called on north of here, but where you're actually sort of wondering, is this going to impinge or inhibit the ability of water to carry out its responsibility, to inhibit the ability of our four-legged animals to carry out their duties, as we say. And so it can happen in those spaces too. It doesn't have to happen, you know, simply, and we appreciate it when you show up for our protests and our reclamation work. But it can happen in your way of thinking too.
Thank you so much. That's a wonderful answer. I think it's about time. I'm looking at my clock. It's about time for the co-host to wrap this up. But I wanted to, before they do, I wanted to say thank you so much, everyone from all the nations and all the homelands, from coming and listening, and especially a big, huge thank you to Neil Patterson Jr. and Dr. Deborah McGregor and Dr. Kelsey Leonard for presenting with us today and engaging with us today. Jessica and Andrew, would you like to
Yeah, Miigwech, thank you everybody. And we will have our next session on June 9th on TEK in Great Lakes Areas of Concern Priority Setting Processes. which will highlight the role of TEK in the St. Lawrence River area of concern at Akwesasne. Miigwech, thank you.